In the opening scene, a young black man named Andre is walking alone at night through a perfectly manicured suburban street. A little sports car pulls up and starts slowly tracking him. Andre gets spooked, says, "Fuck this shit," and changes directions to briskly walk back the way he came. When he turns to see what the car did, he sees it's parked where it was, but the door is open. From out of nowhere, a man in a medieval helmet attacks Andre, renders him unconscious, and drags his body to the car. Rose arrives at her photographer boyfriend Chris's, Daniel Kaluuya, apartment with pastries and coffee. They're getting ready to go away for the weekend to visit her family, and he's concerned that they don't know she's dating a black guy. She assures him that, while they will likely say some stupid things, they are incredibly progressive. Her dad would have even voted for Obama a third time if he could have. Chris asks if he's the only black guy she's ever dated, and she says he is, but she's confident that her parents will be cool. On the ride to her parents' home, Chris goes for a cigarette, but Rose takes it and throws it out the window, warning that her parents would hate that she dates a smoker. Chris calls his buddy Rod, a TSA agent at the local airport, and reminds him to take care of his dog and not to feed him people food. Rod, disapproving of Chris dating a white woman, berates him and says visiting the white folk is a bad idea. He also flirts a bit with Rose, and Rose thinks it's sweet when Chris gets a bit jealous. While they're deep in conversation and not entirely paying attention to the road, a deer darts out in front of the car and is hit. They pull over to investigate and call the police, who ask what they're doing in the area. Rose tells them that they're visiting her family who live nearby. The officer asks to see Chris's ID, but Rose steps in and says that because he wasn't driving, there's no need for that. The officer lets them go, and Chris tells Rose that it was hot the way she stood up for him against the racist policeman. Chris and Rose arrive at her parents' home. Her father, Dean Armitage, is an affable neurosurgeon who, yes, tells Chris that he would have voted for Obama a third time if he could have. Her mother, Missy Catherine Keener, is a strangely cold hypnotherapist. She offers to cure Chris of his nicotine addiction through hypnosis, but he doesn't feel cool with people tooling around in his head. The Armitages also have two on-site black helpers. Walter, Marcus Henderson, the groundskeeper, and Georgina, Betty Gabriel, the maid housekeeper. Dean acknowledges that it looks bad. Two wealthy white people have two helpers who are black, but they were hired to take care of his parents, and Dean would have felt bad letting them go. There's something off about both Walter and Georgina. They have a definite stiff Stepford artificial politeness about them. They also both speak using dated vernacular. Dean gives Chris a tour of the house and shows him old family photos. Dean claims that his father was a track runner who was beaten out by Jesse Owens to compete in the 1936 Olympics in front of Hitler. And while that was sad for his dad, it was still great to have Hitler's Aryan idealism proven wrong. There are also photos of Rose's brother who will be joining them later. He's a surgeon like his dad, but he went through a rough patch. The family gets together for afternoon tea. Missy stirs her tea and lightly taps her spoon against the teacup 3 times, super important later. Missy asks about Chris's parents. Chris claims that his father left when he was young and his mother died after being hit by a car when he was 11. Georgina sort of short-circuits while pouring tea, and Missy tells her to go lie down and get some rest. The Armitages tell Rose that they're having their big party tomorrow. She's surprised and they remind her that it's the same day every year. Rose's brother Jeremy arrives. He's an aggressive, spoiled rich kid. That night at dinner, a drunk Jeremy starts talking to Chris about MMA fighting, saying that Chris would be a natural at it because he comes from hardy stock. He wants to spar, but Chris says that he has rules about play fighting with drunks. Dean and Missy tell Jeremy that maybe it's time for him to go to bed. Chris and Rose retire to their room, where she apologizes to her family, and they go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Chris gets up and decides to sneak out for a cigarette. While outside, he sees something in the distance charging at him. It's Walter. He heads straight for Chris, but makes a sharp turn at the last moment and runs off in another direction. Inside the house, Georgina is staring out a window. It turns out she's looking at her reflection, not Chris. She adjusts her hair, and Chris decides to head back inside. Before Chris can make it back to his room, Missy startles him by turning on a light. She says smoking is a bad habit and offers again to help him quit. He sits but mocks the notion of hypnotism, unaware that she is slowly hypnotizing him, using her teaspoon as a focus object. She takes him back to the night his mom died when he was 11, and he tells her that his mother didn't come home from work, and he was too scared to do anything, like call the police, that would make it real, so he just sat watching TV, nervously digging his nails into his bedposts. Present-day Chris is doing the same thing, digging his nails into the arms of the chair. She taps her teacup with her spoon 3 times and tells him to sink. 11-year-old Chris sinks into his bed, while present-day Chris sinks into blackness, seeing himself and Missy far above. His consciousness has left his body, which is paralyzed in the chair. He wakes in the morning and checks his phone. Rod has sent Chris a picture of him pretending to give his dog beer. His battery is low, so he plugs it in. Chris tells Rose that he thinks her mom hypnotized him last night. He has vague recollections of the evening. Armitage's wealthy friends arrive for the big party. It's mostly older white people who say many inappropriate things to Chris. How he has a good build, because Tiger Woods golfs, he must have a good swing too, are black guys better in bed, etc. Chris sneaks off and finds a blind man named Jim Hudson, Stephen Root, who says that all the people at the party are ignorant. He's an art dealer, and Chris is well aware of who he is. Jim says that he's a fan of Chris's work. He recognizes the irony of a blind art dealer, but tells him that he has a really good assistant who is great at describing pieces. He envies Chris's eye. Jim says that he tried photography, but was never very good at it. When Chris goes back to mingling with the guests, he discovers another black guy. He's about Chris's age, and Chris tries to bond with him, but he too is stiff and unnatural like Walter and Georgina. But something about him seems familiar to Chris. Note: the sharp eye will notice that this is Andre from the opening scene. Chris decides to check in with Rod again, and he finds his phone unplugged again. He plugs it in, calls Rod, and tells him everything that's been going on. Rod warns him that white people love to have sex slaves, and he needs to get out of there. Rose finds Chris, and he tells her how weird everything is, and that his phone was unplugged again. She tells him he's just being paranoid because he's in an uncomfortable situation. He agrees and she leaves. Rod tells Chris to take a picture of the black guy, and he will see if he remembers him. As Chris is about to leave, he's blocked by Georgina, who apologizes for unplugging his cellular phone. She lifted it while dusting the nightstand, and when it came unplugged, she didn't want to mess with it further. He says that it's fine and that he didn't mean to rat her out. She doesn't understand. So he clarifies that he didn't mean to get her in trouble. She gets super weird and lets out a single tear while telling him that the Armitages treat her like family. Chris goes back outside and tries to discreetly take the familiar black man's picture with his cell phone, but has forgotten to turn off the flash. As soon as his phone flashes, the man changes. He goes from overly prim and proper to raving. His nose starts bleeding and he jumps at Chris, telling him, "Get out. Get the fuck out while you still can." Rose is freaked out now too. She asks her dad what happened, and he explains that the flash just caused the man to have a seizure. The man comes out and apologizes for upsetting everyone and says he must return home. Chris and Rose go for a walk, and Chris tells her that he's sure he recognized the guy and that something strange is going on. She agrees by saying that it did not seem like a seizure at all. Chris says that he'd like to go home now. Rose reluctantly agrees. She says she will make up something to tell her parents. Back at the house, Dean is holding a silent auction with his guests, who hold up bingo cards to bid. Next to him is a picture of Chris. Jim Hudson wins the auction. The other guests all go home. Chris goes to pack his belongings and Rose returns and Chris says that he needs the keys to put their bags in the car. She looks for them in her purse as they make their way out of the house. Suddenly, Jeremy appears, blocking the front door. Dean and Missy are there too. Jeremy is ready to attack, but Missy and Dean tell him to calm down. Chris keeps telling Rose to get the keys. Missy and Dean tell Chris that they don't want him to leave. Chris asks for the keys again, and Rose says, very calmly, "You know I can't give you the keys." Chris finally realizes that Rose too is in on whatever this is. Jeremy attacks Chris. Dean yells and Missy clinks the teaspoon on her glass, causing Chris to sink back into the dark void again. Meanwhile, Rod keeps trying to call Chris, but it keeps going straight to voicemail. He looks up at the picture of the guy in the photo and sees that he went missing some time ago, so he goes to the police. He tells a female officer that his boy was kidnapped by white folk to be a sex slave, just like the missing guy in the picture. She calls in 2 more officers to listen to Rod's story. When he finishes, they all burst out laughing. Nobody will take him seriously. Chris wakes up to find himself strapped to a chair in front of a mounted deer head and an old TV set. He watches a video made by Dean's father that talks about immortality, etc. Chris sees that his fingernails have clawed through the leather arm of the chair and exposed the padding. The teacup and spoon appear on the screen again. Ting 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 and he's out. Rod tries Chris's phone again and Rose answers. She lies by saying that Chris left 2 days ago and she's concerned about his whereabouts too. She claims that he left in a taxi or maybe an Uber. Rod tells her that he went to the police and she seems concerned. He starts to realize that something is wrong, so he tries to record the call, but when he starts talking to her again, she tells him she knows he has the hots for her. He tells her she's a crazy bitch and hangs up. Chris wakes up and Jim Hudson is on the screen. He tells Chris that they're going to swap brains. The other people at the party were all about being black, but Jim couldn't give less of a shit about that. What he wants is to be able to see the world through Chris's eyes. Dean has perfected the neurosurgery to make this all possible. And Missy hypnotizes the body donors to prep them for the procedure. He will continue existing in the dark void, but will be able to continue as sort of a passenger. The flashing is an unfortunate side effect as they saw earlier at the party. Ting 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 of the teaspoon and Chris is out again. Dean and Jeremy prep Jim Hudson for a brain transplant. Dean tells Jeremy to go get Chris. Jeremy goes down the hall. We see now they were in the basement of the house and finds Chris unconscious. He takes off his restraints and gets an IV ready. Chris wasn't unconscious after all. He'd stuffed padding from the chair in his ears to block the sound of the teaspoon. He knocks out Jeremy. Dean calls for Jeremy and goes out of the lab area to look for him. Chris rushes him and impales him with the deer antlers from the other room. He knocks over a candle that ignites the blanket covering Jim Hudson. Rose has earbuds in and isn't aware any of this is going on. While she listens to music, she is Googling images of handsome-looking black men with good physiques. Chris goes upstairs and finds Missy. She goes for the teacup and spoon, but Chris beats her to them and smashes the cup. Instead, she attacks him with a knife, but he turns it on her and stabs her to death. Chris goes for the front door again, but Jeremy has returned and puts him in a chokehold. Twice Chris struggles to pull open the front door, but Jeremy kicks it shut. On the third try, as Jeremy kicks the door, Chris stabs him in the leg and breaks his skull with brutal head stomps. Suddenly, the rearview mirror is blown away. Rose is coming after Chris with a rifle. He begs her to stop, but she sees Georgina and refers to her as Grandma. Rose shoots again and misses Chris. From out of nowhere, Walter runs past Rose in pursuit of Chris, and Rose says, "Get him, Grandpa," as he tackles Chris. They wrestle on the ground, and Chris takes his picture. Flash. Walter turns and asks Rose for her rifle. She gives it to him, and he shoots her in the stomach before turning the rifle on himself. Rose is on the ground bleeding out. She tries to reach for the rifle, but Chris bats it away. As he bends over her, Rose puts a hand on his cheek and tells Chris that she loves him. Chris starts to choke Rose, but stops. He can't go through with it. A police car pulls up. Rose calls weakly for help, knowing the local police will throw Chris in jail. But it's Rod stepping out of the police car. Chris gets into the car. Rod looks at the chaos and says, "Man, I told you not to go in that house." When Chris asks Rod how he found him, Rod explains that he works for that saw and that everything will be all right. Rose smiles with her last breath as Rod and Chris drive away into the night. The film ends with Rod driving Chris away from the scene.